Okay. Don't know how long I'll be on today, but I think I just want to share. I mostly want to share a few clips and talk about some issues I see with the reasoning. Let's see.
I'm Richard Branson, and I have a once in a...
Oh, yeah, I don't want to show this. How do I turn this down? Oh yeah, you can now see the number. So if you want to call, you can do it that way. You can email me again if you want to talk about or have a conversation long form. Is what I mean.
lifetime invitation for you. Would you like to travel to...
No.
You know, we look at this whole transgender thing. I gotta tell.
Okay, this is pretty quiet. Let's see if I can make this a little bit louder. Maybe not. Maybe. We'll see. Okay, so this is former presidential candidate.
You know, we look at this whole transgender thing. I gotta tell you, for thousands of years, mankind has known what a man is and what a woman is. And now, all of a sudden, we don't know anymore. Now, is that the height of absurdity?
Okay, so we don't really need much more than this. We have an argument. The argument is that the claims that the transgender community makes about gender is incorrect. How do we know it's incorrect? Because for a long time we've known what male and female are, and so this is an argument from a genetic appeal. Hopefully you can see that things change, right? Just because we've defined something for so many, it's just like for a while, minorities were defined as lesser humans, and so we've always known that minorities, or for thousands of years we've known that minorities are lesser humans, or we've known that black people or Hispanics or basically anybody who's not white is a lesser human. So obviously we should know that now, because people back in the day, they just had common sense. This is not how reason works. We can think of a lot of examples in which the argument that he's giving would not work for a lot of others. So that again doesn't mean that he's incorrect about his conclusion. It just means that the argument that he's giving is bad, and it also it's something that if you're listening to him and you understand reasoning, you understand critical thinking, if you understand logic, you should be put on guard. You should be like, this guy obviously has reasoning issues if he's making arguments like this. And I think we can find another one. Yeah, this is...
Let me see if I can find...
This one's pretty interesting. This one's a long appeal to genetics, and see if you can hear it.
So then I said to him, yeah.
I also feel like the other one's not genetic appeal, but still, it doesn't matter. You actually don't need to formally define fallacies to know that they're fallacious. All you have to do is think of an analogous argument that the warrant would not work. If I gave you an argument that sounded almost exactly like yours or was based on the same reasoning and you would reject it, then it's bad reasoning. That's how reasoning works. So I'm pretty sure if I went up to Ben Carson and I said, we've always known that black people are a lesser people, therefore we should believe it now. We shouldn't start defining them as people. He'd be like, that's a ridiculous argument. Yeah, but that's the argument that he just made. So it's the same deal.
How to customize your car insurance with Liberty Mutual, so you only pay for what you need.
Well, Miss Martin, really?
Hey, greetings, everyone. Lieutenant Colonel Alan West. I was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, and I just heard some news. and it has to do with the Hollywood movie industry. And as you may not know, Georgia has become one of the largest movie production facilities and studios in the United States of America. I think it's second or third after Hollywood. Well, I just found out that Will Smith and Antoine Fuqua.
So this is definitely a genetic appeal he's making here, not what he said so far, but see if you can identify when he's making an error in reasoning.
I believe they have decided that they are going to move their movie Emancipation, it's supposed to be a drama about slavery, out of Georgia in protest of the Georgia voting law. I found it very interesting that Will Smith and Mr. Fuqua wanted to do this because, well, the Republicans were the ones that stood up and fought against slavery. As a matter of fact, if you go back and look at the history of the Democrat Party, all this talk about Jim Crow, those were the Democrats that implemented the policy of...
Okay, so this is a genetic fallacy. He's saying because at one point a group of people that we defined as Democrats were people fighting for racism, and people who identified as Republicans were fighting against it, that now in this day and age that must be what's going on, or any arguments that the Democrats are making in terms of something being racist, those are illegitimate because historically in the past there were a group of people that identified as Democrats that were racist. So now the argument that they're making now, I don't need to deal with that. It's just automatically racist. And all the arguments that come from Republicans are justified because they were not racist. And this, we can think of a million reasons that this would be incorrect, right? Words change, people change, time changes, right? Or it's kind of like, if you want to think about it this way, I can't remember exactly what the name is, but North Korea has the word democracy in its title, and so they call themselves a democracy, they must be a democracy. It doesn't really, it loses sight of the fact that definitions change and time changes, and so you can't use it for an argument. You just can't do it. It doesn't mean that he's wrong. He might still be right in saying that the voter ID laws are not racist. He could be correct in that. But saying that they're not racist because traditionally Democrats are the racists is a genetic fallacy. It's incorrect. That's not how it works. You have to deal with the arguments that are being made by Democrats now that the voter ID laws are racist. And actually, now that I think about it, I might go try to find a debate on voter ID laws. I think that's what I wanted to do. But it's funny because he just continues to make the same argument. This guy is like, people look up to this person, right? Like they cannot tell that this person is making a faulty argument. They don't have the skills to do it. So, this is the reason that we have all these issues in society. It's just because people cannot identify. And sometimes it's hard to do, and also depending on whether or not it's a deductive or inductive argument, and whether or not the error pertains to that, it can get complicated. And certainly, as we understand more and more about the universe, we'll start to understand that this thing that we thought wasn't fallacious is now categorized as fallacious because we now have enough information to say, actually we wouldn't accept this argument in these contexts that now exist, so we have to label this argument a fallacy and you can't use it. But most people don't even know that conversation is being had. And also, really quick, if you want to know, so in terms of all this, who cares? Who cares that there are things that are labeled fallacies, or in terms of the scientific method or epistemology, the building of knowledge? Why does any of this matter? The best that I can do is say that if I sat down and had a conversation with you, which is possible, or if you read on it, you would see that these things are very self-evident. They're self-evident. So, for instance, in terms of the genetic fallacy, if someone, this is, a little bit crazy, but I'm going to do it anyway. If someone made the argument that someone shouldn't be able to shit their pants at a company meeting, and and then they say, well, we shouldn't do this because it's going to create a really bad odor, which is going to make it harder for people to think. It's going to make it hard to concentrate, may even spread disease if it starts spreading things everywhere. So they've now given an argument as to why people should just not be able to shit at the meeting. And I go, well, hold on. Weren't you a baby at one point? Doesn't that then mean that you shat your pants? So, you were a pants shitter at one point, right? So therefore your argument is invalid. That's not the way to dismiss what that person's saying. That person has made points that you have to contend with. So it completely negates the fact that people change, right? So just because that person who has made that argument at one point did in fact shit their pants does not mean, again, I understand it's ridiculous, but the point is you still understand that, oh, yes, that would actually be a poor rebuttal to that argument. That person hasn't at all addressed the points about the odor or the distraction that it can cause or the possible spreading of diseases. They've now changed, they've redirected the conversation into something else. And so that is self-evident. That's what we call self-evident. So if it doesn't work there, it can't work for the voter ID laws when it comes to Democrats. It doesn't matter who's making the argument. You have to contend with the arguments, not the people. And so he's going to continue to go on and do this.
Jim Crow, segregation, slavery, whatever you want to call it. And they continue today with the soft bigotry of low expectations. But when you think about this move, emancipation, well, that word has a lot of meaning because of the Emancipation Proclamation that was signed because of a Republican president, Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah. So again, we're just going to continue to look into the past. We're going to continue to ignore the fact that none of this matters for the arguments that are being put forth by Democrats about voter ID laws being racist. You would have to contend with their arguments now and today, and trying to make this about the identity of the Democrat is irrelevant to arguments. And again, we can think of a million reasons why this should be the case for everyone.
And there in the state of Georgia, Mr. Smith, I want you to remember that the very first member of the United States House of Representatives that was black, well, he was a Republican.
Yeah, so just going to
from Georgia,
Mr.
Jefferson Long. So I think maybe you should look at your history and make sure that you get it right. And oh, by the way, hey, Will, show me where you can go without an ID. I don't even think you can get on an airplane without an identification. I know that I can. Now, does that mean that these airlines are racist? And when you look at the Georgia election law, there are many other states.
Yeah, so that may be a bit of a non sequitur. I don't want to get too much into that. I think that could also be a straw man. I don't think the point is they're asking for your ID so it's racist. It's that they're asking for your ID on something very specific that has to do, like, you're not more American for traveling, but it is part of your innate rights to be able to vote for representatives, to vote on laws. These are more fundamental, I would think, than traveling. And so I'm not sure that it's not overtly fallacious, let's say. I would need to think about it more. I feel like there are definitely some aspects of it that are overt, but I was really just interested in the genetic fallacy that he made that you can go look up. It exists. It's a real thing. You can think of a million examples on your own. What I'm saying is that if somebody did it to you, you would be like, oh, that's wrong to do. Okay, well, if it's wrong to do, then don't do it to other people. And it's funny because this is actually really common among Republicans to do this, to use this, oh, Republicans are the anti-racist party and Democrats are the racist party, historically speaking. And they continue to make this same mistake. Just go look up genetic fallacy. It's a bad argument. And again, I can't look at you being a youngster and saying, well, you shit your pants, so therefore you can't make any arguments about not shitting your pants. You can't talk about how that's wrong or this and that because you used to do it. It's a genetic fallacy.
For Democrats, they have election laws that are far more restrictive and stringent. So again, all of this background noise that we hear from...
And that also might be a fair point that he's making. I don't know what he's referring to because he doesn't say, but maybe there are laws by Democrats that are more restrictive. That also by the way, that would be what we would call a tu quo qui in reasoning. Oh, well, you do it. So it's just like, okay, so I'm going to ignore your argument, and I'm going to say, so if that person makes an argument about shitting their pants and then does it, even right then, you would think maybe there's this, like, again, it's funny because a lot of people talk about, like, things being a matter of feeling, like, oh, I'm tired of all these people thinking that feelings trump their facts. And it's just like, and these same people, like, they're clearly heavily into their feelings. So maybe the feeling is that, well, that person shit their pants, so they can't make an argument about shitting your pants. It's just like, no, that's not how arguments work either. You have to deal with the argument they made. Even if they did it right there, right then, in front of you, it would be fallacious to point it out and say, so therefore your argument is wrong. You have to deal with the facts they've given you and talk about whether those facts are true and whether those facts lead to the claim that they're saying it should lead you to. And if you don't do that, it's fallacious. If you try to deviate from that, it's fallacious. Because you wouldn't want that done to you. You would want someone to deal with your argument, right, and not just try to make it about other stuff.
These Hollywood elites, these corporate fascist oligarchs, it doesn't have a hill of beans of a meaning to any of us. And oh, by the way, Roland Martin, I think you call me gutless for not standing up and speaking out against voter laws. Well, guess what? I fought in countries where we wanted to make sure that they had honest, free, and fair elections.
Okay, I'm done with this. But yeah, it's crazy. Like, this guy is a representative, and he's also not like, he's not. There's lots of people who are like this. There are a ton who clearly don't understand reasoning, but they can get people to admire and vote for them because those people also don't understand reasoning. Like, it's just something that is unfortunately the fault of the education system. Like, we just need. I also used to think a lot like these people. I didn't know that there was this thing called epistemology or this thing called critical thinking, or I didn't know logic was like, there were mathematical components to logic that you could learn and know, like, oh, what's being said is logical and you can prove it mathematically versus something that's not logical. I didn't know those things exist because we don't teach them. And so then we're like bewildered when we grow up in a society where people vote for people who are also highly unreasonable. And this actually transcends party lines. Even though, like, I am Democrat, it is only because there is a subset of Democrats that I find actually do understand arguments and argumentation. They're Democrats or they're independents. They tend to stay inside that. There are very, from what I've seen in my limited exploration, I have found less Republicans that seem to understand even some of the basic principles of epistemology or logic or critical thinking. Which again, the point I was actually trying to make there is that there are plenty of Democrats who clearly also don't understand it. They use fallacies all the time. Whether or not they're doing it intentionally is a whole other thing. That's one of the arguments that's made for Trump. You can find fallacies everywhere that he uses, and it's like, okay, either he's using them, he knows he's using them, but he knows that his audience does not understand reasoning enough to pick up on the fact that what he's saying is unreasonable, which isn't good because he's fostering that type of climate. My actual guess is that he just doesn't understand it himself. That is my actual guess, because he makes the same mistakes over and over. Like, I could find, I'm gonna look it up. Let's see, Google. So let's see, Trump, tweet. What is it? Cold. Snowing in New York, I think was. So this is probably close to it. Yeah, it's freezing and snowing in New York. We need global warming. So it's this idea that if it's cold in one specific area, the globe can't generally be getting warmer. So it's like if I were to, it's like if I was pointing out that like a house was on fire and it was getting hotter a lot, but like it was actually like colder in the fridge. Like maybe the fridge is having some type of response where it's actually getting colder in areas of the fridge. I point out an area of the fridge and I say, well, the area in the fridge is getting colder, so the house can't be on fire. You would see how that's cherry picking is what we call it in reasoning. So again, this is demonstrating poor reasoning. There's another one. Let's see, Donald Trump tweet. Vaccines cause autism. Yeah, so healthy young child goes to doctor, gets pumped with massive shit. This is actually relevant to what's going on today. People make this mistake a lot. Why aren't people getting vaccinated? Well, it's because they don't understand correlation causation fallacy. They do not get it. So of course they're not going to get vaccinated. Like you have to, like, there are things I guess we don't want to teach in public school because we're afraid people will not get it. I think that's condescending. I think I think part of it is teachers don't want to be entertaining, which I've heard them say, my colleagues, unfortunately, and it's just like, suck it up. Okay, like we're in a new era. This stuff's important. Like, be entertaining. And it also sucks when you don't have funding, which I understand. But part of getting funding, by the way, is convincing people who, yes, they should know better, but they don't. But convincing people who don't know better that you are actually valuable. And part of that may be actually entertaining them. But yeah, so a healthy young child goes to doctor, gets pumped with massive shots of many vaccines, doesn't feel good, and changes. Autism, many such cases. So correlation causation fallacy. These kids also probably ate breakfast. So let's, maybe breakfast causes autism. Or maybe they all happen to drink orange juice. So orange juice causes autism. A bunch of people doing something and then having something happen later does not mean that one thing causes the other thing. That's why you need studies. That's why you need grand scale studies. You need larger studies with larger sample sizes. You need meta studies. You need studies that are looking at multiple studies that have large sample sizes and are all coming to the same conclusion. Yeah, I mean, like, you do lots of and this is this is about feeling. Like, so you feel this way. You were already skeptical of vaccines, you got the vaccine, and then this bad thing happened to you. Well, the vaccine must have caused it because you're already in the mindset, and now you feel that way. And then it's funny because you will hear these same people say facts don't care about your feelings or this and that, and it's just like you are totally fixated on your own feelings. You can't even describe what logic is. You use the word a lot, but it becomes apparent in conversations with some of these people that they haven't actually even done like a basic search. But let me see. Oh, what was I going to do? Oh, voter ID laws. Voter ID debate. Let's see if we can find something. Oh, yeah, this guy. This could be Dinesh D'Souza. Yeah, I haven't seen him in a while. Probably because he was in jail.
One day installation.
Sorry, that was a cheap shot, but...
Because you need your bath every day. Bath Fitter. It just fits.
5 surprise toy mini brands.
Oh,
now
God,
with 40
two
more of your
commercials.
favorite toys made mini. Can you find the super rare gold? Out now.
You want support Rollermark Unfiltered?
Yeah. Also, him being in prison has nothing to do with his arguments. He can make very good arguments. Let's see what's going on here. And I also want to keep in mind, when I'm watching a lot of these Democrats, I don't even like... I've just started to see this guy. I think he works with TYT. I could be wrong about... No, I am wrong about that, actually. I already know I'm wrong about that. But I've just started to see this guy, so I haven't really gotten time to form an impression about him yet. But there are plenty of Democrats that I also think, like, they either barely understand reasoning, they barely understand logic or epistemology, or they don't at all, or they have a very loose grasp of it. I think we all can kind of intuit to some degree that something is logical or not logical, but understanding why it's logical and why it's not logical will get you much further. So let's skip to the actual conversation with Dinesh. Let's see.
.com. This is still the issue today. So, perfect example. I hear Republicans talk about 64 Civil Rights Act, 65 Voting Rights Act. Supreme Court gut section for Shelby v. Holder. Sensenbrenner, Republican, Wisconsin, has a bill, says, you know what, we need to address this. Republicans won't touch it. Goodlatte wouldn't even have a committee hearing. These are all Republicans. Okay? So when Republicans start talking about Party of Lincoln and look what we did with the Voting Rights Act, well, why won't you do anything about the Voting Rights Act today? Why won't you even have a hearing? Why won't you even address it?
Because there's a lot of, it's like the immigration debate. The reason that, look, you're asking a different question. Why has there been a breakdown of the traditional types of compromise that parties can make? So, for example.
No, that wasn't the question I asked.
No.
That wasn't the question I asked.
But that's the correct question. I'll tell you why.
No, the question I asked was, if the Republicans tout Lincoln and tout their support for the 65 Voting Rights Act, why won't Republicans today deal with the Voting Rights Act in Section 4 being gutted in Shelby v. Holder?
Because...
Okay, so again, I want to point out that an argument really hasn't been made yet. So you have to understand that. So he maybe has some type of claim that the Voting Rights Act was helping fight racism. And it's also obvious that he's presupposing, which he should not do, that Dinesh and Republicans feel the same way. But an argument hasn't been made yet.
Partly because the Republicans suspect that the Democrats' complaint about issues like voter ID and so on are a ruse for letting illegals vote.
That's
and
nonsense.
No, it's not nonsense.
It's nonsense, Dinesh.
If it's nonsense, why don't you address it?
Dinesh, it's nonsense.
If it's not an issue.
I have Dinesh.
Is a different...
No, I'm going to let it go.
That's what it is. There is.
How difficult is it to get an
There is
ID?
document. First of all,
How hard
okay,
is it?
hold on. Let me walk you through it.
Okay.
This is what happened in Pennsylvania. Okay. The head of the Republican Party in Pennsylvania in 2012 stood up and said Mitt Romney is going to win Pennsylvania because of voter ID. That's what he said. Here are the games Republicans play. In Pennsylvania, they said, okay, if you don't have an ID, you can get a free ID, but you need to come into the office, sign the affidavit stating that, and then we'll notify you about the ID. The person goes back home. You have to come back in and physically pick up your ID. They broke down the study of how many people who were elderly, one, how that going back and forth on a couple of occasions ain't the easiest thing in the world, and how difficult that was. Not only that, in other places, they then said, oh, if I want to get my birth certificate right now, I can go to the Harris County Bureau of Vital Statistics to get a birth certificate. This is a certificate that shows when Roland Martin was born in the hospital. Republicans said, no. You need to get the one with the raised seal. Now, even though this is an official state document, they then said, no. Have the raised seal. You had some folks who were married 50, 60 years ago. You got to have your marriage certificate. There were very specific attempts. So when you say how hard is getting an ID, that's not the issue. It's how hard do you make it to get an ID.
Right, but remember, Roland, IDs are used in American society for innumerable things.
But a lot of people also don't use an ID.
Right, but all these magical difficulties don't appear. Here's my point. We need IDs for when we travel.
Yeah, this is definitely a red herring here. I don't like the arguments that Roland Martin's making, by the way, or at least I'm not saying the connection yet, or it's tenuous. Like, I understand, I already know what his argument is, so I'm presupposing, I'm looking at it in a positive light. I don't think he's describing it well here, but Dinesh is, again, this is the same thing with the last person, that like, well, IDs are used for lots of things, and it's like, yes, but voting is one of the most fundamental rights that we grant to Americans, and we understand why it's very important for that to happen, because they need to be able to advocate on behalf of themselves and their group and their family and whatever. So it is a non sequitur to then say, well, it's used for these other things. And again, we can think of examples in which we would not want, that's not answering the question as to whether or not it's racist, the fact that it's used in other things. It can be used for millions of frivolous things, but it's where it's important that matters. So, it's like if you had to pay to vote, and we know economically certain minority groups would have a harder time doing that, right? And you're like, well, they pay for stuff all the time. You have now changed. You can think of, immediately why that's a bad argument, or at least you should. If maybe I need to think of I need to be able to put people who have trouble empathizing in the shoes of others. But the idea is still that that's not addressing whether or not making someone pay to vote does have a racial component to it, just because people pay for frivolous things.
We need IDs for your children to get
Actually, you don't need an ID when you travel, because I've actually traveled and forgot my driver's license, and there are other methods that they actually go through where you can still travel. But go ahead.
Well, the point I'm trying to make is that it is important to make sure that the people who vote are eligible to vote, right? That's a fundamental point.
Yes.
Because otherwise, other people cancel out your vote and my vote who shouldn't be voting.
But Dinesh,
right?
the first of all, the reason that...
So you're giving me anecdotal evidence of, hey, in Pennsylvania, they want the raised stamp.
No.
And I'm saying we should, once we agree on the ID principle, I think we can come up...
That's not what anecdotal means, but we'll go on from then.
...with ways to make sure that there's a reasonable enforcement of that principle.
This is the issue. As long as you have Republicans who are systematically creating ways to limit folks from voting, that's the problem. You have a situation in Texas. In Texas, nearly 1 million folks were disenfranchised because of Texas voter ID law. 5 federal judges said discriminatory intent. 5. Okay, my home state, North Carolina. The federal judges looked and said they have the emails where Republicans in North Carolina said, get me the information when black people are voting early in North Carolina. Got it to them, and they said 70% of black folks are voting in the first week. Okay, we're going to limit early voting locations in the first week to just one early voting location. They literally devise methods to deny folks from voting to make it harder. We know in Wisconsin.
And so he has made an argument here. I don't think there's any fallacy there. We need to recognize that this isn't deductive, so it's not proven 100%. But there's a strong case to be made here that there are motivations to limit racial black people voting in order to manipulate or control the results of elections. Does it mean 100% that's what happened? No, but inductively, you have federal judges that see it. You have emails where they're asking for very specific information. That certainly doesn't look good. Let's just say that.
Wisconsin, when the voter ID in 2016 was approved by the Obama Department of Justice, a federal judge called in Governor Scott Walker's office and said, why are y'all dragging your feet on the issuing of voter IDs? So even though there was a voter ID that was approved, then they were slow in getting it out. And the federal judge said, what the hell is going on? Studies show that upwards of 200,000 people, not just black people, but elderly white folks, were impacted by them dragging their feet on voter ID. The point is this here. And I'm telling you, the one fundamental issue that will always get in the way of black folks even listen to the Republican Party is as long as they are putting in place things that are making it harder for folks to vote, and it's precision like targeting, black folks will say, I'm not going to deal with you. And that's a fact, Dinesh, that even black Republicans...
He's not going to let Dinesh talk, is he? That's a shame.
Republicans are trying to tell their own party, y'all need to stop this. This is not making our job easy.
Frankly, Roland, you are raising an issue that I'm not fully knowledgeable about, and so I'm trying to be sympathetic.
Dude,
I'm trying to think out loud. But I will say this:
I've lived it.
Yeah, I will say this. I think
that's fair of him. That's decent of Dinesh to do that, to just acknowledge that he doesn't know, and extending some sympathy. That's pretty cool of him.
I think that the issues you're raising are quite legitimate.
Hey, fam, I want you to like.
Oh, that sucks that he cut that off early, but yeah, not too much there. I think maybe I'll just watch one other video. Oh, maybe let's watch some Destiny. How long is this? An hour. I really like example, and again, my position is that whenever I watch these debates, usually, not always, especially when we're talking about the whatever the academic, like the highest orders, like scientific, whenever the scientific community disagrees with the general public, and I go and try to like scour through the details and I ask, okay, who understands reasoning, who understands epistemology? It is usually the public that doesn't, and it is usually, and actually I would almost say always, like almost always, it's the public that doesn't, and it is the scientists, when they have consensus, that do. And then the next one would be like academic. When it's academics versus the public, it's the public that doesn't understand it. Generally, it's the academics that do. And then Democrats are like the lowest order. So the Democrats make plenty of poor arguments, and there are plenty of times where I've actually thought, like, I'm noticing some real fallacies in what the Democrats are saying. But generally speaking, and I do think it's closer toward 50-50. But when I hear Democrats speak, I get a sense that they understand reasoning generally more than Republicans. Let's see. And I actually don't know where Destiny stands on this, because he always surprises you. But this one actually says that he changed someone's mind, so I'm going to listen to this. Actually, what's this? 19 minutes. Yeah,
this is a real B&H customer story. Jack and Barbara, professional wildlife photographers.
Yeah, so you probably can't hear that now, which is good.
Wait, coming up today on News Talk, those new laws that require voters to show photo ID at the polls. Are they intended to? In a moment, he's a progressive activist in the District of Columbia. Raynard Jackson is here. He's a
I hope this is a debate.
And commentator from Maryland. Good to see you.
Thank you, Bruce.
Reverend Hagler joining us in just a second. Good to have you here today.
Thank you.
What do you think about the new voter ID requirements, the photo ID requirements that have popped up in many states over the last couple of years?
Well, I support voter ID, and there's nothing inherently discriminatory about it. Now, where I criticize my party, the Republican Party, is that you don't do voter ID and election law changes during an election cycle. You do it during an off-election year, but the voter ID in and of itself, I think, is a great idea.
Why?
Well, simply because, number one, you don't know who people are when they go to vote. Now, you can go up there and say, "Hi, I'm Bruce DuPoit," in your polling place. They don't know whether you're Bruce or not. So what's the problem with showing a government-issued ID? We got to go into the...
Right, so we have an argument here, and the argument, and I actually don't, just because there's one argument for something doesn't mean that that thing is correct. We've had that conversation. And just because there's a certain argument that is bad doesn't mean that the conclusion is incorrect. But the argument here is that we should require voter ID. What's the date? Now, actually, I'm starting to see an issue here. So the issue is more that it hasn't been proven. The data is that it would reduce the amount of fraudulent voting, and that could be true, but that's where we do need data, and that seems to be presupposed by a lot of Republicans, that it just would. And it's like, well, you need the evidence to show that, and it actually has to be significant. And we would actually, I would hope we could all agree that we would not want a circumstance in which requiring voter IDs would end up disenfranchising more legitimate voters than it would limiting illegitimate voters, right? So ultimately what we would want is a situation in which there's a high reduction in the amount of illegitimate voters or fraudulent voting, and almost no or very little impact on legitimate voters voting. That's what we would want to avoid, and that's where I don't hear... That's the burden of proof, as far as I'm concerned, and that's where I don't actually hear a lot from Republicans giving that information. Maybe it's out there. I've done some research on this. I've certainly never heard, and this is from 2015. In the years that I've been listening to this debate, the debate on this topic, I have not heard one give anything like that. It's actually the same issue with the election being fraudulent. I think I talked about that in another video, so I won't go over it too much. But the burden of proof is actually you have to prove that the amount of fraudulent voting was atypical in the Trump and Biden election, and that it would have changed the results. And you really need both of those. Otherwise, it seems that you clearly have some ulterior motive in pointing that out. That ulterior motive being that you want to make an election that was not fraudulent seem more fraudulent, because the reality is that there's always an issue with. It would be amazing, right, if it was just perfect, not one person that shouldn't have voted, not one person that shouldn't have voted didn't vote. Yeah, not one of those illegitimate voters voted, and the people who should have voted did. Like, it would be amazing if that would be a model to do everything from then on out, because it would be a perfect system. It's not realistic. So the reality is it happens every election, and the Trump-Biden election was absolutely no different.
Congress, the airport, to go to do a banking transaction. So this notion about it being discriminatory is a bunch of bullcrap.
Why do you think it's generating so much controversy?
Because I think the Democrats have been masterful on the PR side of the issue and turning it into a racial issue. And when you mention race to Republicans, they're like deer in the headlight. Whether they're guilty of anything or not, just the mere allegation stymies them.
Reverend Hagler, good to see you. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Raynard Jackson.
How you doing?
Raynard Jackson, Reverend Hagler. Good to have both of you here. Raynard Jackson supports photo ID. Many people see something other than a desire to make sure our elections are fair and fraud-free at work. What's your view?
Well, the issue is there's really been no fraud except when we elected President Bush in Florida, right, which was basically decided by the Supreme Court. I mean, the fact is that we've been doing this for years. There's been not the exclusion of voters. The only exclusion of voters has been when states have illegally put in place types of restrictions that prevented people from voting. So when we talk about voter ID cards, you're really talking about another level with which.
Yeah, so again, let me go back. I have to listen to this again because I was kind of phasing out a little bit.
Why do you think it's generating so much controversy?
Because I think the Democrats have been masterful on the PR side of the issue and turning it into a racial issue. And when you mention race to Republicans, they're like deer in the headlight. Whether they're guilty of anything or not, just the mere allegation stymies them.
Reverend Hagler, good to see you. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Raynard Jackson.
How you doing?
Raynard Jackson, Reverend Hagler.
Good
to have both of you here. Raynard Jackson supports photo ID. Many people see something other than a desire to make sure our elections are fair and fraud-free at work. What's your view?
Well, the issue is there's really been no fraud except when we elected President Bush in Florida, right, which was basically decided by the Supreme Court. I mean, the fact is that we've been doing this for years. There's been not the exclusion of voters. The only exclusion of voters has been when states have illegally put in place.
So he's saying, and he may be right or wrong about this. Again, this is something that you would need data for. But he's saying that traditionally this hasn't been a problem, and there have been no claims of fraud up until. Well, he didn't say this, so I am sort of putting words in his mouth. This is what I'm assuming he means, but there haven't been claims of fraud until Republicans were losing elections. And so therefore, there are reasons to believe that this isn't being motivated by facts at all. It's not being motivated by the fact that we know that voter IDs would reduce the amount of fraudulent voting. It's just based on politics, so to speak. I feel pretty confident in saying that that's what he's trying to say. I'm not going to get into the debate that he's having about Bush winning in Florida and it going to the Supreme Court. I'm not interested in that.
Types of restrictions that prevented people from voting. So when we talk about voter ID cards, you're really talking about another level with which to prevent people from voting.
But photo ID is so common in our world, and voting is so important. Why not marry the two? Why not? Because you would hate to get to your polling place in your neighborhood on election day. You may have waited on a line. If you're like me, you love the election day atmosphere, and you're excited about being able to make your preferences known and participate in the electoral process. If you got to the table and the lady said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Reverend, someone else already voted in your name," you would really be upset.
But the issue with that, Bruce, is if we make some openness in terms of everybody being able to vote. For example, in my community, my church, I got people without ID cards. I got people who don't drive. I got people who've given up ID.
So hopefully that was actually anecdotal. So earlier we heard Dinesh D'Souza claim that something that was an example or evidence of something, he called it, well, you can have anecdotal evidence, but it wasn't a specific story. So now we have a hypothetical situation being contrived here in order to try to prove a claim, which you can't do. So it's just like, under the instance where this thing happened, wouldn't you want this? And it's just like, well, you would have to prove that that instance actually occurs. That is the burden of proof.
Cards a long time ago, who are maybe elderly now, so whatever they have is not even updated with their photograph, a contemporary photograph. So the reality is this is very class biased. This is in a sense, it's another layer in order to keep people from being able to vote. There's all kinds of other ways in which to certify people's voting. It's like when I go into the voting booth in Washington, D.C., my address is certified. My previous signature is certified in the ballot before I'm allowed to vote, before I'm giving a voting card. There's all kinds of ways, and what we need to be about is really figuring out ways in which we open the doors for people being able to vote rather than to close the door to exclude people from voting.
Raynor Jackson, there is no disagreement that we're seeing more of these laws in the recent period. We've seen more in the last couple of years than we probably saw in the decade prior to that. Is it because we can point to actual voter fraud as the triggering mechanism for this new wave of laws?
It's not about voter fraud as far as having a prima facie case to make that there has been fraud perpetrated in the electoral process. It's about voter integrity. That's the difference. Now,
I feel like there's a bit of word salad going on here. That's so no, that is his burden of proof is that he needs to be giving evidence that there's fraudulent voting that warrants requiring voter ID. Otherwise, you can't be making the claim that it increases integrity. These things are intermingled, but let's see what else he has to say. Maybe he'll be more specific about what he means by voter integrity.
Isn't it amazing, Bruce, during the congressionals last year, voting was down, which is expected, not nationwide. But you know where the voting turnout increased? It was in the state of Georgia, which has one of the most restrictive voter ID laws and one of the larger population of blacks. Blacks outnumbered as far as turnout any other group in the country last year. Why do you think this?
Okay, so I think if I understand, so again, this is correlation, causation, I'm pretty sure, because I think the argument that he's making is, which is also another way to approach this, it's completely legitimate, is that requiring voter ID laws might actually increase voter turnout. And so what's your evidence? Well, this happened in Georgia. So, again, then we need our warrant. If this has happened in one location, then voter ID laws do, in fact, increase voter turnout. You need way more information than that. It's a step in the right direction, though. But yeah, you can't say that definitively.
This is happening. What do you think at the bottom line, reality level, what's going on? What's the motivation? What's the bottom line?
I always urge people not to be ahistorical. After Reconstruction, we put in place all kinds of ways in which to keep particularly black populations from the polls, even intimidation, as well as literacy tests, poll tax, all those other types of things. This is really another manifestation of that. You end up with the Supreme Court gutting the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which we just...
That might be a fallacy. That's one that I have to think about. So historically this thing has happened. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's not. By the way, fallacies aren't always clear cut. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. I think inductively you could build that argument that this has been to disenfranchise groups, and this seems like another roadblock. But I guess what you would want to try to avoid is saying, getting into what we were talking about earlier today, a genetic fallacy, is saying because this thing has happened in the past, these groups are still doing the same thing. They don't have, whatever their arguments are illegitimate. So yeah, that might be related to the genetic fallacy.
Just celebrated 50 years of that.
That's not true.
And yes, they did. And so they gutted that, and immediately you have all these states, the former Confederate states, that began to put in place all kinds of implementations with which to restrict voting. And again, that's a part of the reaction to really the third Reconstruction that we're in now.
What does it say to you that one party seems to be driving the bus here?
Well, it's one party that does not really want to face the electorate, really does not want to face the length and breadth of the electorate, don't want to face black folks, don't want to face Latino folks, want to make sure that the people who vote is the narrowest kind of constituency that they can define.
He's referring to your party, Raynor Jackson.
Yeah. Let's talk about this voting rights case that the Supreme Court dealt with.
And we'll do that. We'll do that. Can you respond to the point that Reverend Hagler just
Well,
made?
that's totally not true. As I was telling you earlier, liberals have done a masterful job of scaring Republicans by using the word race, voter suppression, because that evokes a certain memory back to the civil rights days. There is no such thing as voter suppression. How is it that President Obama won in 2012 Indiana, which had a voter ID law? That was the first time a Democrat had won Indiana since 1964. And guess what? Turnout was up.
Now that is fallacious right there. So again, this is a situation in which I feel like there's reasoning issues with both of them, but this guy is really bad about making these types of arguments where, he has an instance of something and he thinks that can represent a larger argument than it does. Some type of correlation, causation, fallacy.
30% in Indiana. So if this voter ID is supposed to depress turnout, it's not working.
And so just because in one instance, the connection that's supposed to be being made here is that because Obama, because a certain area was actually in favor of Obama, that these voter ID laws can't be racist, and that does not follow.
Had a Huffington Post reporter here yesterday who said that in one state, I hope I'm not wrong, my best memory is she said it was Texas, allows gun club ID
but not student
ID.
Which is stupid. That's totally stupid. And see, this is where Republicans get in trouble. They take a good issue on principle and then screw it up by not allowing the student to use the school ID.
Because it's a racist agenda.
That's not a racist.
It is a racist agenda.
Okay, so
that's a heavy charge. Why do you make it?
Well, I make it as a racist agenda because everything that they've been about has been to marginalize the population of black folks, to marginalize.
But wait a minute, Bruce had to show an ID as well. So if it was racist, it would only be for us.
Brother, understand your history now.
Oh, I live history.
Right, coming out of Reconstruction, we met with all of the restrictions.
That has nothing to do with what we're talking about today.
And we had to push in 1965 to put in place a Voting Rights Act.
Does Bruce have to show his ID?
The Supreme Court since has stripped.
Does Bruce have to show his ID when he goes to vote?
Okay, so he is wrong in saying that because white and black people are both subject to the same thing, that it can't be racist. It's like I can let two people run in a race, but one of them I put a bunch of tacks down or I put a bunch of blocks down, so that it makes it harder to run. Well, because they're both racing, it can't be racist. Like it is if I know, it is if I know that that it's not going to be equal for both people running the race, or I let them both race, but I know that one of them is going to run on a terrain that's going to be much more difficult than the other one. Then it can be biased. It can be biased towards one person, or even if you make it about a group, it can totally still be biased against the group. My position is that it is racist, so I agree with him that it's racist. What I don't agree with is because there's a history of it, that has to be occurring right now. I think inductively you would be foolish not to consider it and to see what else is going on there. I think the evidence is there that it is racist, but just saying that historically these roadblocks have existed, so therefore what's going on now must exactly be racist. I'm not seeing the connection there.
Engaged in a battle with which to enfranchise those.
Does Bruce have to show his ID?
We're trying to deal with folks who are still coming out of prison, still dealing with my mother and father who are senior
But that has
citizens,
nothing to do with the Voting Rights
Act. Do not
Act.
have active, really photo voting IDs. I mean, the fact is that we're trying to open up the doors. Why in a democracy do we want to close the doors? Ask the question.
I'm with you on that. I support more people voting.
The issue is more people.
Yeah,
not less.
I agree with you on that.
That's where we got to come from.
But does Bruce have to show an ID when he goes to vote?
I don't know what Bruce does in his jurisdiction, right?
Yeah, I don't. They don't require.
No, but I'm saying if the voter ID is across the board. It's not just black folks.
State by state.
No, but I'm saying within that state, everybody in the state has to show ID. It's not just black folks.
But I'm saying that those who are in power are putting in place the rules with which to restrict the population that they're most afraid of.
Let me tell you an example.
And there does seem to be evidence of that. So that is where I think he's on point. He's using the contemporary evidence to make that argument, and that's okay.
And you need to stop trying to defend.
No. Let me give you a real example.
Does the gun club student ID example where if you have a gun club ID, that's a legitimate form of ID for you to complete the voter registration process. If you have a student ID, it is not. Does that dovetail with the larger point you're making?
Oh, sure. I mean, it really smacks at the sort of the discrimination in terms of the constituency you want, which is gun-toting folks who got gun IDs versus students who you define mostly vote liberal or progressive, and therefore you don't want liberals or progressives to vote.
If it only applies to the black community in the state of Texas. It applies to everyone in the state of Texas.
So it's discriminatory.
It's still discriminatory. It can't be by definition.
I mean, no, you can argue by definition or whatever you want. When you start putting in place things to restrict a certain, certain profile of voters.
Yeah, so again, I just explained why his argument cannot work. You can have a situation in which you are creating the same, you're allowing two people to participate, but the way that they're participating, you are actively creating restrictions for just one of those people or even a group of people. So yeah, in terms of arguments, it just doesn't work.
Right, students.
But it's not profile.
You're arguing if the rules apply to everyone, they're fair on their face.
Exactly.
Right, but that's not the case right now.
We'll sneak in a quick break here.
And that's not the argument.
Reverend Braylon Hagler and Raynard Jackson. A break, yes, and back with more right after this.
Okay. I'm actually going to stop here. This is like it's analogous to like the, well, white people and black people both have water fountains, so it can't be unequal. Because black people and white people both have water fountains. It's not, no. Like, we can think of a lot of arguments in which two people may have access to something, or maybe even impose some type of barrier for both types of people, but that barrier is clearly more restrictive for one group than the other. And the people know that, and in that situation it would be a bias toward that group, and if you make it about race, then it's racism. So just by virtue of thinking of other instances in which that argument would not work, you can look at this person's argument and say, okay, the argument also doesn't work for you. Yeah, I think I'm going to leave it there because there's some noise going on outside. It's getting pretty loud. So